Great. So today we're going to be talking about educating for the end of the world. And so hopefully that's a catchy title. The image may draw you in this apocalyptic scene of a school. Maybe this is a good depiction of 2020, right? Where we have this apocalyptic sense that has really moved into and impacted our education system. But I want to think about this more in some theological terms. And so when we think about education, I think we can readily identify a number of theological foundations for how and why we educate. And so we could go through this list and maybe spend some time thinking about each one. For example, we might think about how the doctrine of God, how our view of God as the grounding for the good, the true, and the beautiful, how that informs our desire to know what is true, how it gives value to our pursuit of truth, as well as our pursuit of the good and the beautiful, right? So it's not just knowledge seeking, but it's also creative endeavors that have intrinsic value that's tied to our understanding of the person of God. Then, of course, there's the doctrine of creation. And there's lots of ways that this plays out. I'm particularly keen on how it plays out in the sciences, right? So I think of C.S. Lewis's summary of the history of science, where he says, man became scientific because he expected law in nature, and he expected law in nature because he believed in a lawgiver. And so certainly the doctrine of creation gives us a reason to expect that there was some kind of order, there's some kind of consistency to the natural world that we can then come to understand and appreciate. Connected to that is the doctrine of humanity, that humanity has been made in the image of God. So we have the Imago Dei. And it's really these two work together. It's not just that there's order in creation, but the fact that we're made in the image of God means that we are created to participate in creation, expand creation, that we can actually understand the world around us, right? Our minds are designed to make sense of the world around us. And, I could go off on a tangent here and talk about how there's this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, the natural sciences, our ability to do mathematics, and the ability of mathematics to explain the universe seems to fit in very nicely with these doctrines. And in other academic fields, people could talk as well about how these doctrines provide a foundation for their thinking about the field. But then we can go on to the doctrine of redemption. So many of us will appreciate the statement of Ellen White when she says that the work of education and redemption are one. So there's some sense in which the image of God perhaps has been marred in humanity, but that education is restoring that image of God. That image of God includes individuality, the power to think and to do, right? And so when we educate individuals, when we promote human flourishing, this is a restoration of the image of God. This is an aspect of the work of redemption. And of course, there's other aspects of redemption as well. We think about how the ministry of Jesus included the healing ministry of Jesus, how there was a social consciousness that was very present there, and how much of educational systems is geared on producing people who are able to do useful service, right? Useful service in this world and the world to come. And then there's ecclesiology and missiology. And so there's just the practicals of, the Puritans needed a way to educate the clergy, right? And so that we get institutions like Harvard. So many of our old colleges in the United States, and of course in Europe as well, were just founded on the practical basis that we needed a place to educate ministers as well as civic leaders. But the one I want to hone on today is the question of eschatology, where I think it's a little bit harder to tell that story, or at least maybe we don't tell that story nearly as much. How does eschatology fit with our education? And maybe it even seems opposed, right? Like if you really think the world is about to end, are you going to send your kids off to college, right? And maybe in our Adventist history in particular, we wrestled with this. Now, it's also the case we've had Adventist educational institutions and higher education institutions from nearly the beginning, right, the 1870s. And so there seems to be some way that our pioneers worked this out. But there is, it seems, somewhat more of a tension there, or more of an open question of how does eschatology, how does an apocalyptic vision, how is it a foundation for education? It seems like, if anything, it might be a threat to education. So there's an article where George Knight has argued, though, that this is exactly the case. And so when Knight thinks about the greatest threat to Adventist education, he would argue that it's the apocalyptic vision that has made Adventism a dynamic worldwide movement. When that vision is lost, Adventism will become merely another toothless denomination. Another place he says we've neutered Adventism, right? He says the losing of the apocalyptic vision and the Adventism's place in prophetic history is the greatest threat that Adventism and its educational system face in the 21st century. And so for Knight, at least, he would argue that Adventist education must be Adventist, not just in its understanding of what it means to be human, not just in its understanding of creation, its understanding of God, but its sense of Advent, a sense of the imminency of the return of Christ, that this apocalyptic vision is central to what Adventist education is all about. But so I was at this presentation of Knight where he presented on this theme with a number of other faculty, and I remember talking to faculty afterwards, and it seemed like there were maybe three responses, and I don't want to like make it generational, but it seemed like among older faculty there was a polarization where some were like, oh yeah, preach it, brother, bring back the good old apocalyptic message, and others were like kind of rolling their eyes, right? But I think a number of perhaps particularly younger faculty weren't antagonistic to this vision, and yet just didn't quite understand what it was saying, right? Like what does an apocalyptic vision really look like in being played out in an educational system? It's not that maybe I have baggage against it. Maybe I even think that there's something kind of cool here. Maybe I'm open to this. But I want to understand, what this really looks like when we think about education, particularly in 21st century terms. And so I'm going to try and explore that a little bit today. I want to ask the question of what is an apocalyptic education? What do we mean by this? And to do so, I'm going to try to characterize apocalyptic education as having three aspects to it, and we could probably refine these, or maybe we could debate some of them. But I want to suggest there are three aspects that might be a good characterization of apocalyptic education. The first is a linear view of history, that in some sense history has been leading up to this moment. The second is a vision of the future that is radically different from the present, so things will not continue to go on as they have been. And the third is a sense that our world is about to give way to another one. Now, in some sense, I think just like hearing this description, already 2020 you could say, is an apocalyptic year, in that we're entering into a world that's radically different than the world we knew a few months ago, right? And so the world has given away in these apocalyptic terms. But I want to perhaps use even grander apocalyptic vision. It's not just like a short-term disruption, but there's some way in which history has been leading up to this moment, and the world is about to give way to a radically different one. And when we define apocalyptic education in this way, I think it helps me to begin to understand what it might mean, because I want to suggest and argue for the next few minutes that in many ways education is already deeply apocalyptic. There are many of these aspects that are already present in just secular forms of higher education. And maybe if we can take a moment to appreciate how secular higher education is already apocalyptic, we can begin to think about what an Adventist take on an apocalyptic education would really look like. And so to do this, I want to think a little bit about the doctrine of the millennium and how the doctrine of the millennium relates to history. So here's one description of what it means to have a premillennial view of history. So remember that a premillennial is the sense that apocalypse will take place prior to, so we have different views of the millennium. And so there's a premillennial and postmillennial, and it's just different views about if history will give way to a reign of peace, that they would ultimately will end in apocalypse, or if the apocalypse will interrupt and usher in this millennium. And so listen to this description of a millennial view of history. The evil of the world must proceed to its height before, in one great complete root and branch upheaval, it would be swept away. Millennian pessimism about the perfectibility of the existing world is crossed by a supreme optimism. History, the millennium believes, so operates that when evil has reached its height, the hopeless situation will be reversed. The original, the true harmonious state of society, in some kind of egalitarian order, will be reestablished. And so this maybe harmonizes with our reading of Revelation, where essentially, we can't perfect the world. The world is a mess. It's getting really bad. But then suddenly there's going to be some great sweep, some great event where the hopeless situation is reversed and an egalitarian order is established. Now, while this describes well our reading of Revelation, this actually comes from Tuveson's the Millennium Structure of the Communist Manifesto, where in it he argues that the Communist Manifesto is fundamentally a millennial document. It's a document that argues for this view that through revolution will usher in this new age that will fundamentally change history. And Tuveson will go on in this article where he actually argues that it was the millennial fervor in America and particularly in England in the late 1830s and the 1840s that influenced directly Marx and Engels. And so he goes on to argue that this Millerite, hope for the end of the world, right, that would usher in the millennium, had an influence on Marx's thinking that then appeared in the Communist Manifesto. And so the idea here is the idea of the end of history. That history has been characterized in a particular way, but now it's reached its climax. Now it's something fundamental has changed. And so for Marx, the characterization of history is that all of history, he says, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. And so then the end of history would be the classless society, right? It's where we no longer is there this economic division of the classes of those in power against those who are being oppressed, but we remove class from society. And very much in the Soviet Union, when history was taught, it was taught in these terms that they were at the end of history. And so I think you already see a very apocalyptic narrative developing here. You can think of communism fundamentally as an apocalyptic movement. In contrast to this, there's also, I think, a sense, though, that in the West, we have an end of history narrative. So Fukuyama this is late 80s, and then this gets published into a book in the early 90s. He argues that Western liberal democracy has prevailed, right? There's no longer any competitors to it. That throughout the 20th century, it had defeated all the competition. Ultimately, with the fall of communism, all that remains is liberal democracy. That this is the ultimate form of how humans will organize ourselves, and that going forward is the anticipation that any government that wants to be serious in the modern world will organize themselves in some form of liberal democracy, right? Okay, so this very much characterizes the 1990s, and I think this very much is present in the Western Academy, that if you look at like political scientists or historians, they have this sense that Western democracy has won. Western democracy, the liberal democracy is the way to organize ourselves. So I was reading a book by Fareed Zakaria, and we actually read this as a faculty recently, and I would recommend everyone to read this book if you're interested in a defense of a liberal education, of a broad education. But in this book, Zakaria seems to resonate somewhat with the sense of where we've arrived in terms of history, where he reflects upon his time in college. And he would say that, this is him in the 80s. He says, my friends and I would sit around in coffee shops and passionately debate the American nuclear buildup, the proxy war in Central America, Reagan's and Thatcher's policies. The divisions were deep, the answers were unknown, and the consequences were believed to be huge. We live in a different age today, one in which there are fewer grand ideological debates with great consequences. As a result, our youth are not very political. Our age is defined by capitalism, globalization, and technology. The young reflect today's realities. Their lives are more involved with these economic and technological forces than with ideology and geopolitics. And that means there is less scope for grand theorizing, fewer intense late-night bull sessions, less stirring eloquence at the student forums and political union, It's a new world, and the young know it. So Zakaria publishes in 2015. So this was written in 2014, and it's his sense that maybe the youth are a little bit apathetic about grand political questions because we've pretty much figured it out. Between the combined forces of capitalism, globalization, and technology, we've pretty much solved it. There's no big contest between liberal democracy and communism, right? There's no grand contest of ideas taking place. And it's like this gets published in 2015, and then 2016 happens. And it's like, man, was he like this did not age well, right? Like you suddenly move into this political moment where these forces are being questioned in some pretty dramatic ways. Like globalization, you have this resurgence of nationalism, not only in the United States, but across the world. You can look at Brazil, you can look at India, you can look at Poland. You have this resurgence of these various nationalist movements that have questioned if globalization has really benefited them the way that it was promised, right? Or you look at capitalism, and the critique of capitalism has just been pretty scathing the last 3 or 4 years, particularly on a university campus. I think it's one would be hard pressed to avoid people discussing the failures of capitalism, and there being rigorous debate about what kind of how should we organize ourselves, right? So perhaps that leaves then technology, and so perhaps technology remains our savior in some sense, right? And I suppose in the midst of this pandemic, with everyone eagerly awaiting the development of these vaccines and now the mass production of them, maybe still we have this sense technology is the thing that pulls us out. And so what I want to shift to now is thinking a little bit about technology. But before I do, just this idea of the end of history, is in some sense a very Christian idea. But I want to suggest that if we think about the Christian idea of, if you look at Revelation 21, that history is heading somewhere, that there's going to be a radically different future, a new heaven and a new earth, that fundamental to the idea of the Christian view of the end of history is that we're not there yet, right? We haven't arrived yet. And I think what that should do is it should remind us of the fragility of this world, right? That the social orders that we find ourselves in can be very quickly disrupted, that there's a very thin line that separates the way we organize ourselves now from the way we may find ourselves in the not so distant future. And I think that should make us hesitant to accept either a Marxist view or even the one we may be more sympathetic to, Western views that liberal democracy have prevailed, but recognize that these institutions, that these structures are very fragile. And if we have that sense, I think things like perhaps the 2016 election, things like this pandemic, while they may still be upsetting, it won't come as a total surprise. It won't be a total narrative shift from we thought we had developed past this, or we thought history was going a particular way, and how are we suddenly thrown back into a pandemic that's the stuff of 1918, right? Not 2020. But I think that we should have a more cautious view of history, given the sense that we believe we haven't yet arrived at the end of history. So perhaps that's one way in which the Christian view of history may relate to views that are already commonplace in the academy. But I want to move to technology. And so there's this thrilling discussion that you should all watch between N.T. Wright and Peter Thiel. And they've actually done a few of these. So Peter Thiel is a founder of PayPal, Silicon Valley investor, tech guy. And N.T. Wright is the well-known New Testament theologian. And they have this wonderful discussion on imagining the future, it's called. And in this discussion, they compare Silicon Valley's visions of the future with that of the Hebrew prophets. And there's this sense that what they both have in common, both the Hebrew prophets and Silicon Valley have in common, is a sense that the future will be radically different from the present. So maybe we take that for granted now, that 10 years from now, the world will look very different, and 20 years from now, even more different. But if you think about most of human history, things seem pretty static. And so when the Hebrew prophets came on the scene and they anticipated a future radically different from the present, it really was an innovative idea. And it's a similar idea that perhaps characterizes Silicon Valley today. And so what I want to try and do is now spend a few minutes suggesting the depth of that parallel. Saying it's not just that, there's these Silicon Valley visions of the future will be different, we'll have, better iPhones or something, but that this is really done in apocalyptic terms. And there's a whole technological eschatology, you might say. And then I want to suggest that technological eschatology trickles down and influences education. So who are the prophets of Silicon Valley, right? Well, probably people like Elon Musk, these individuals who have these grand visions of the future, and they often talk in apocalyptic terms. So when Elon Musk is talking about SpaceX, for instance, he'll say things like, there are just two fundamental paths for humanity. One path is we stay on Earth forever, and eventually some eventual extinction wipes us out. So it could be something like an asteroid or something like a pandemic or something like nuclear holocaust. But then he says the alternative is to become a spacefaring and multiplanetary species. So the reason we need to colonize Mars and then ultimately become not just multiplanetary, but move to new solar systems as well, is because like the human survival depends upon it. We'll soon destroy ourselves on this planet, so we need to go and inhabit some new ones. So these are very stark, very apocalyptic terms to use to cast his vision for space exploration, right? It's not just we want to go to the moon to show U.S. dominance, even though that already is a pretty strong message. But it's these the fate of humanity depends upon this, and so that's why he invests in things like, let's figure out how to get rockets cheaper. So let's develop these reusable rockets, and pulls off stunts like sending Tesla into space, which is perhaps the most expensive commercial ever made. So yeah, so he does these kinds of things, but all of these like cool innovations are under this grand apocalyptic vision of the fate of humanity depends upon this, right? In addition to space travel, we have another huge force in this apocalyptic visions, which is artificial intelligence. And particularly over the last few decades, we've had some really exciting innovations, right? So in 1997, IBM's Deep Blue defeated the world champion in chess. And then in 2011, Watson, I don't know, you guys may have seen this game, Watson defeats Jennings on Jeopardy. Now Jennings complains that Watson had a faster like click time, right? So it just came down to this issue of maybe Jennings wasn't able to like, click the button as fast, and maybe that's what led to the difference. But still, it's pretty impressive. And then in 2016, this is a big one. Google's AlphaGo defeated the world champion Cyril at Go. And so Go is a very complex game. It was considered that it was thought this was going to be pretty far off, and so when AlphaGo was able to do this, it was heralded as a pretty significant advancement. But the thinking goes, if we keep developing AI that's able to not only play chess or Jeopardy or Go, but if we can keep developing AI to solve more and more problems, if we can eventually develop artificial general intelligence, so what would that mean? That means that it has some kind of general intelligence. So any kind of problem a human could solve, that this general AI would be able to solve. But it's able to constantly be improving itself. So it wouldn't take long then to have an AI system vastly superior to human intelligence. That then we not only are able to solve problems like chess and Go, but we can solve the big problems facing humanity like climate change, or how do we allocate, or how do we distribute resources, or problems like how do we prevent and mitigate against pandemics, right? There's really big problems. And so there's a lot of hope that AI ultimately becomes this kind of godlike figure, this savior figure that saves us against the biggest problems facing us, because it'll be able to just be smart enough to solve all of these problems. Well, there's also a redemption narrative for humanity in this. So again, Musk, looking at his investment in Neuralink, and Facebook and other companies have similar programs, where what they're looking at is trying to essentially increase the bandwidth between the human brain and computers. So right now we have pretty low bandwidth. We just have to type to talk to your phone or talk, and it's very difficult to get a lot of information out or in from your brain to a computer. But if we can develop a richer neural link, then Musk explains this vision of billions of people with high bandwidth linked to the AI extensions of themselves. It would make everyone hyper smart. So perhaps there'll be humans in conjunction with their AI selves that they are linked to, that will be able to solve the big problems facing humanity, right? And then there's even a vision of immortality, of eternal life here. And so here's one roadmap to how we get to immortality, where we began by creating a computer model of a very simple brain, and we just work it up to more and more complicated brains. And then eventually, once we have this sufficiently powerful enough neural link, we can find a way of creating a model of your brain, and then we can upload your consciousness into a computer, and then you've achieved digital immortality. And so there's a rather developed here eschatology that both has as general AI, some kind of like godlike figure, some kind of savior or messiah. You have a hope for immortality. And I just want to suggest, these visions of the future really influence people, right? Like not just Elon Musk, like Jeff Bezos and others are spending their fortunes, these billionaires spending their fortunes on investing in space travel or these other programs to bring about these radically different futures. So this would be part of sometimes people talk about like transhumanism, the idea that we'll be able to take control of our evolution, not just through digital technology, but also through biohacking, things like CRISPR, right? And so through the combination of biohacking and advances in AI, we will, so in one book, Homo Deus, we'll move from Homo sapien to Homo Deus. We now control our evolution. We've achieved, we've merged with God, right? Okay, so what I want to suggest is that this stuff actually already plays out in higher education. And so, I went to college at Stanford, right there in the heart of Silicon Valley, and there very much was an ethos of this apocalyptic narrative, this secular tech apocalyptic narrative on campus that was even reflected in the classes. So, at our Christian universities, we have religion classes, and in those we indoctrinate people into the Christian worldview, not in a negative sense, just we educate people into the Christian worldview. Whereas at Stanford, there would be classes like when I was there, they had this Introduction to Humanities course, a freshman course called Humans and Machines, where you would explore, what's the difference between humans and machines, and some of these issues of what it means to be human, and the possible future of humans and machines. That curriculum was revised into something called Thinking Matters, but they still have classes called like Technological Visions of Utopia, where they look at both the utopian and dystopian visions of the future. And then it even comes down to like how people think about and live their lives, right? So apocalyptic vision isn't just about imagining the future, it's also about how we orient our lives today. And here we have at Stanford a very popular class, Design Your Life, which is taking design thinking, a very powerful tool from companies like Apple that are using their product design, but applying it to how one designs their life. So you have a job of figuring out how to live a meaningful life. So let's use these tools from Silicon Valley to do it. And yeah, I mean, I like these classes. Design Your Life's also a book right now. You should read it. It's great. I think this is, I'm not dogging on this education at all. I went through it and I benefited from it. But there was a way in which I think we start seeing apocalyptic vision is informing it. But it's an apocalyptic vision that's rooted in these technological vision of the future, and then these other forms of apocalyptic visions as well. And so I think what I want us to do in our discussion groups is to spend a few minutes thinking about how biblical eschatology relates with various secular and technological visions of the future. I don't think it's all contrast. I think there are probably some points of similarity, right? Both, for instance, imagine a future radically different from the present. And there are probably ways that the two enrich each other. But there are maybe also ways that the biblical eschatology can serve as a corrective to some aspects of secular or various technological visions of the future. And then the second is I want us to begin wrestling with this question of how should our apocalyptic understanding impact how we educate? And so I've been suggesting there are already these secular eschatologies that are already influencing how education takes place. And they're very powerful. And I think, they've produced some fantastic universities, and they've produced a fantastic education in many ways. Things that, lead to high paying jobs and exciting visions of the future. And so I just want to wonder and have us think about, do we still have an eschatological vision that perhaps speaks to today, that we can still include in our educational system, that can still inform the way that we educate? So I'm gonna pause there, and I'm gonna send us out into small groups in order to discuss these questions.